Tonight is our third graphic novel panel. Two of the panels have been held in conjunction with the Small Press Expo, which concludes today. Our panels feature some of the best and the brightest in the field, discussing a variety of topics related to this growing and fascinating format. Today, we'll be discussing the crossover appeal of graphic novels between young adults and adults. All of the authors present tonight have work that falls in that category, be it a beautiful retelling of classic stories, a strong-willed and powerful young woman battling evil and society's weaknesses, or complicated and harrowing tales of heroism by preteens fighting for their lives. Tonight's panel will be moderated by Heidi MacDonald. We are so happy that Heidi agreed to be here tonight. Her knowledge of the comics world is inexhaustible, as evident from her own creation, The Beat, which is an independent online news platform and go-to resource for news on the comics industry. She is also co-editor with Calvin Reed of Publisher Weekly's Comics World. It is this background and her extraordinary knowledge and experience that makes her the perfect moderator for tonight's discussion. Next, I would like to introduce Farel Dalrymple. The Children and Teens Department has worked very closely with First Second Books in the last few years, and especially as we have developed this series on graphic novels. I am always just a little bit breathless when I receive their updates for their upcoming releases, and I'm equally overjoyed when I receive an email from their publicist about the possible visit of one of their authors. And thus it was some time ago when she asked if we'd like a visit from Farel. Well known for Popgun War, It All Will Hurt, and Delusional, and with a gold medal from the Society of Illustrators, Farel Dalrymple's latest book, The Wrenchies, a book where comics are magic, quite literally. The Kirkus Review says, think of this as an insidiously macabre, Coraline-esque tale meets Charles Burns, morbid and discomforting, not for the faint of heart, but what a ride for those who go with the flow. Our entire department was delighted the day we received an email from Gareth Hinds saying that he was moving to the neighborhood. We had long been fans of his work. His retelling of Homer's classic, The Odyssey, has been a standby for booksellers for young readers grappling with this classic since its release. We are further delighted to see him and his lovely wife, Allison, visiting the store regularly to enjoy events and browse the shelves. As with The Odyssey, he is best known for taking challenging and dramatic classics and adapting them to the graphic novel format. His most recent work is Romeo and Juliet. In this book, and according to the Horn Books Starred Review, Hinds explicates and amplifies Shakespeare's story on every page, including wordless fight scenes that highlight pivotal details. And I am sure we are all anticipating his next adaptation, Macbeth, due out in February next year. Our next panelist is Jim Rugg, co-creator of Street Angel with Brian Maruca, as well as Aphrodisiac, who makes a brief but excellent appearance alongside teenager Jesse Sanchez in Street Angel. If you haven't read the book yet, you should meet homeless, tough, and charismatic Jesse, who fights ninjas, drugs, nepotism, and pre-algebra. Jim teaches at the School of Visual Arts in New York City, but you will also know him well as co-host of BoingBoing.net's Tell Me Something I Don't Know podcast, in which writers, artists, and filmmakers are interviewed about their work and the practicalities of their careers. And now, please help me in welcoming our guests.
Thank you so much, Carrie. I mean, what a wonderful, warm welcome, and great job introing these guys, so I don't really need to explain how awesome they are, but I'm a fan of all three. So the topic that we had today was graphic novels as they move between juvenile and adult fiction, and how creators, I think, adapt to those different conditions. So all three of you, I guess, I kind of think all three of you straddling the line with your work, maybe being tweeners, I mean, certainly the Wrenchies, Farel, I mean, the first few pages of that don't look like they're really for young, very small children at all. But it is considered a YA book.
Yeah, that's what First Second tells me anyway. My publisher.
Yeah. Well, let's talk a little bit about the three of you with your three most recent works. Now, The Wrenchies is kind of a dystopian. I think maybe it looks to the at first glance, it does look a little bit like dystopian teenage fiction. It's a pretty popular genre, but then, as they said, it goes off in this much more dark and fantastical, area thanks to your amazing art on it. But I mean, did you immediately conceive of it as being for younger readers, or what was the origin of that?
Well, I wasn't like thinking about it being like a kid's book or a young adult book or anything like that. It was just the kind of book, the book I wanted to make. Like most of my work up to this point has been all ages stuff, and the story itself came out of a short story I did for an anthology, and I had some swearing in it in my comics for the first time, because like I guess I just kind of wanted it to more like I don't know, like reflect my own life, you know, and it seemed to kind of fit the story well enough, you know. But the dystopian thing as being like a young adult, you know, like a popular genre. I certainly wasn't even aware that that was like a thing when I started the book 5 years ago, so I don't know. It didn't seem like that was quite as a thing then.
Right. It wasn't. Yeah.
And so as not just with that, but like there was a lot of things as I was working on the book over all these years that I kept seeing come up in popular culture, and I was like, oh well, people might think that I was trying to jump on the bandwagon or something, but then I have so much stuff going on in there that I just was like, well, I mean, so what if they do? I mean, whatever. It's just the story I wanted to tell, you know? And I kind of let my publisher and the marketing team and all that like worry about like who it was supposed to be for, you know?
Is it just debuted, right? It just came
Yes.
out, and it's actually on the New York Times bestseller list this week for graphic novels, so kudos. Yeah.
Thank you.
Have you had a chance to meet your readers yet for the book? Have you had a chance to see who's reading it, who's picking it up?
Well, some. I mean, at the Small Press Expo this weekend, I got to meet a lot of people that seemed to like the book. A lot of people that hadn't read the book but have heard about it. The coolest thing to me so far, because I guess the original release date was supposed to be today, and then it got kind of bumped up due to some shipping things, you know.
The ugly behind the scenes of the publishing world.
So some people had it early, and I've been getting kind of some emails from people randomly, and the coolest part to me was all the peers, you know, the friends that I've had that know that I've been working on the book this long. That was I guess the neatest part to me. It was like hearing all the positive feedback about, you know, the book from all these people that
Right.
you know, that I really consider that I respect and admire, you
So
know.
when you sit around the graphic novelist round table later on, you know, you can put your book out there and sit at the table.
I guess yeah, I hope it doesn't play
Well,
out exactly like that.
It
but-
is a beautiful, amazing book. I mean, the art on it is so extraordinary. And I mean, as they mentioned, you did win the gold medal for illustration. And I mean, all of your works have been very, very, you know, beautifully illustrated, and not necessarily in a style that you'd think of as being traditional comics. Just a lot more intricate, a lot more emotional, I think, maybe in a way. So, but you know, this is an incredible story in that style. So, you know, come back to that. Now, Gareth, you are best known for your adaptations of work. I mean, I guess when Homer was telling his stories, they did not have a category of all ages, right? But I mean, did you always see your work as being for younger readers or for all ages, or, you know, who was your target when you started doing your adaptations?
No, I mean, I think, like Farel was saying, basically I was doing the book that I wanted to see, and, you know, actually I was at a panel yesterday at SPX where Jules Pfeiffer was saying, like, basically the audience is always you, and that's true. I was creating a book sort of for me, but it became obvious pretty early on as I was trying to market my books that, particularly with Beowulf, which was kind of my breakout book, that actually the people who were really responding to it were teachers and students who actually had to read Beowulf, and it was like this great bridge for them to get into the original without just being kind of thrown into the deep end of the pool of all this text in a you know, Old English dialect or a verse translation thereof. And so from that point on, I've been more aware of who my audience is. But ultimately, it doesn't really change what I'm doing very much. I'm a little bit more aware, okay, you know, like in The Odyssey, maybe if I had done that first, there would have been more nudity in it. Now I'm aware that nudity might hurt my sales, but in general, I'm still just doing the book that I want to do for anybody of any age who maybe didn't have a good experience with that classic the first time around, or never has been able to get through it.
Yeah. Now, do you find that there are, I mean, you did King Lear, which doesn't even seem like the most likely thing to be a comic book, to be honest.
Yeah.
I mean, do you find that some of the stuff in there is like you have to tone it down, or?
Well, I do think the Shakespeare ones, I'm using the original. I'm using the original Shakespeare. I'm abridging it somewhat, but because it's Shakespeare, it's definitely sophisticated language, and so those skew a little older. Like, I think Candlewick markets those as like 14 and up. That's King Lear and The Merchant of Venice, and Romeo and Juliet maybe a little younger, because I was a little more conscious of trying to make sure the language was accessible. Beowulf and The Odyssey are used with students a little bit younger, because those, I'm using translations, and they're just, the text is more accessible. But as far as the subject matter, I don't know. I mean, I guess King Lear is probably the most sophisticated subject matter as well. But any of the other ones I think are appropriate, middle school, high school. But basically, they're being bought by families and by teachers at whatever age the kids are actually encountering those books in school, I think, for the most part.
Now, Jim, with Street Angel, is actually, it came out originally when, 2004, 5, 6? 5, 6?
2005 or 6.
2005 or 6, yeah. So, in this beautiful reissue, and I mean, I don't always want to harp on this, but like when it first came out, this spunky young teenage heroine. Well, she's just a tweener, right? She's how old is she?
We never say, and she's an orphan,
Yeah.
sadly, so she doesn't actually know her birthday. So no one knows how old she really
Right.
is.
But
But she's about 12 or 13.
Yeah, she's in that tween age. And, she's like this really spunky female heroine. And I have to be honest, like when you did this book, there was so few characters like this in comics. I mean, now Marvel and DC are getting a little bit more on it, a little more hep to the fact that these can be great stories. But did you mean it to be for kids, for girls? Who did you create Street Angel for?
I meant it to be for people like me that just weren't thrilled with what Marvel and DC were doing at the time. That's what I happened to see in comic book stores, and I was frustrated with a lot of that. It was very narrow focus. It was to a lot of, I think, 30 and 40-year-old men, and I just wanted, more variety. And it's, I do tend to look at stuff and think if there's a very popular genre, maybe do something else. And in comic book stores, there weren't, as you said, a lot of young female protagonists, and so that seemed like, I would be able to do whatever I wanted, and I wouldn't have to worry about some other book stealing my ideas or, beating me to the punch, so to speak. And, there was no limitation to the kind of stories I could tell with that character, especially within the superhero genre. So, yeah, I wanted to entertain myself mostly. I didn't have a lot of readers back then. It's probably my kind of a breakthrough book for me in that sense. So a lot of the comics that I was making were comics that I wish existed. If it existed, I would have been reading it instead of making it.
Right. Now, it came out in multiple formats. First, it was a traditional periodical comic. Then it was collected. Now it's been collected in a more deluxe edition. I mean, did you find that your readers did you have young girls read the book, or was it mostly, the 30, 40-year-old men over the course of the life of the book?
I hear the most from the 30-year-old men. But the initial publisher was a small publisher out of California, SLG, and at the time I looked at a lot of publishers. I had put together the first issue, and then I was trying to find a publisher, and I did look for a publisher that I thought targeted more than just that traditional comic book direct market reader. And SLG had a lot of books that seemed to,
Well,
one of the more diverse lines of books.
They definitely did at that time.
So that was something I was conscious of and trying to reach that audience. One of the decisions I made early on with the book was to make the covers pink, like this kind of a pastel soft pink. And I did that because I went to a comic book store. I looked at, there was a wall of new comics, like one of these walls of books, and I was trying to figure out what would make my comic stand out. There was no pink on that wall. And I realized very quickly if I could put a square of flat pink, at the very least it would catch people's eyes, you know, on this sea of other bright primary colors. You know, and to me that was a signal to potentially to women readers, or, you know, really anybody. I think it sent out a sign. And we were talking about pink today at the show, and I said I don't think it's that, you know, it's not that dynamic of a color today. It's not that new or exciting. And it's probably because I've been looking at it for 10 years, but I think it does still stand out. You know, I think it does send a message and draw the eye.
Well, I think once again, it's, you know, the beautiful art on it as well. And, you know, all three, Gareth, your work is so visually stunning and, you know, imaginative. I mean, taking these classics and really reinventing them. So, I mean, so it sounds like really all of you are, just as Jules Pfeiffer said, you're just doing it for you. And whoever wants to come along for the ride is fine. So, you know, and luckily others do want to come along for the ride. But, you know, Gareth, you kind of alluded to this a little bit, and that, you know, you are more conscious of the fact that if this is going into a school or into a, you know, a library, that you might have language difficulties. And, I mean, do any of you feel more moving forward that, you know, you want to concentrate more on comics for adults or comics for younger readers?
Well, I mean, I definitely am focusing on the educational market right now. And for example, I'm aware that not only is it a matter of the age, but it's also a matter of which works are actually taught. There's thousands of classics, but not all of them are actually taught in schools. And it seems to be, my sales seem to be very sensitive to how frequently a particular book is actually taught. So, you know, I'm trying to stick pretty close to the center of the canon, and, you know, it's great that the Common Core released a list of exemplars, because that's a good, you know, place to start. But I will also say that, you know, there's this weird thing we've talked about. You know, we're talking about this crossover between children's or young adult and adult, and the fact that that division exists is kind of a weird thing, and it's not necessarily obvious to everybody in the audience, but there is like this very polarized kind of thing where you're either marketing to children and young adults or you're marketing to adults. And it's partly because a lot of stores, like here we have, you know, separate sections, right? There's often separate buyers. And so getting that crossover, you kind of have to start in one place and then try to get it to cross over to the other side. And just by virtue of who my publisher is and the fact that they're primarily a children's and young adult publisher, I'm starting on the children's side and trying to cross over to the adult side. But it's always, you know, it's always a challenge that, you know, I wish was easier.
I don't know what distinguishes. Like, I saw Hunger Games. My wife loves young adult fiction, and so I get drug along to movies and stuff. And I saw Hunger Games, and it's extremely violent. Like, I don't know what the line is between young adult and adult. I just try to make stories that I feel like making at the time, and then figure out how to sell them once they're made. You know, it is an issue trying to separate the business side from the creative side, and I want to try to keep those two separate. And my way of doing it is make the work I want to make, then figure out like what category or how to sell it, or work with a publisher, you know, who knows actually how to sell the work better than I do anyway.
Right. Farel, are you going one way or the other?
No, well, I would say like just like the nature of whatever, like the way my brain works is like I'm kind of just like rebellious against like systems in general. So it's like I thought like when I was making it, I mean, this sounds like, I don't know, like conceited or something, but like what I was trying to do with my book was like kind of like change comics. And like, so I guess like that's mostly like people that are aware of kind of what's going on in comics or have read comics before, and they read this. It's like, oh, I kind of see there's a lot of stuff. Maybe I can see where some of the stuff is coming from, but it was put together in a way that's like, I don't know how to classify this. Like, I don't know. And it's like that to me is like the best thing. But at the same time, I didn't want it to be like real heady or like too like esoteric or anything. And it's not like stream of consciousness or anything. Like there's definitely, like I see where the story's going, you know? So it's like I wanted it to be like fun for like anyone to read, but like kind of in the way that like, yeah, maybe some parents wouldn't want their kids reading it, but like maybe some parents would be cool with their kids reading it, you know? Like I probably would see something like that as a kid, like Heavy Metal magazine or something, and be like, what is this? This is crazy, you know? I don't understand what's going on, but this is like really exciting to me, you know?
Yeah. Yeah, it's always a little bit better when your parents aren't entirely on board with it. So, sorry, parents. Farel, you worked on another book that was really interesting, which was actually, I mean, talking about adaptations. You did a book. I shouldn't even bring it up because it's not even in print. Omega the Unknown is not in print, is it?
I don't think so. I mean, yeah, I'm not sure.
Yeah, because that was a book that was...
It's for Marvel Comics.
It was for Marvel Comics, which is... and you've done some stuff for Marvel, but this was your most sustained work for them, right?
Yeah, it was 10 issues and then collected into a hardcover.
And it was an adaptation of an older comic book that was adapted by the novelist Jonathan Lethem, who's, you know, amazing in his own right. And... I mean, I loved the original and I loved your adaptation. I mean, what was it like working on something that was this kind of really kind of quirky adaptation of an old comic book, you know, with a more literary kind of update, I guess?
Well, I was a fan of his writing before I ever, you know, even knew that that was going to be a thing. And so, yeah, I just got an email from him, and I was already familiar with the way he wrote, so it just seemed natural to me. Like, reading that comic was just like, oh yeah, this is a type of comic Jonathan Lethem would make, you know, which was totally what I would want to do. I could tell that it was like really close and personal to him. Like, he loved that series. Like, I could tell, like, it was like really important to him to like talk to Steve Gerber and like get his blessing. And
I mean, it was kind of like, it was about a young boy who befriends this kind of superhero from we don't know where, and, you know, kind of the superhero helps him get through some things, and mysteries abound, right?
Yeah, I mean, I don't even know if they like befriended each other. It was weird because I guess it was a superhero book, but it had very little superhero in it. Like, the character, the Omega the Unknown character, wasn't around that much, and so like, yeah, this boy was the main figure who didn't ever really put on the costume until like the very last issue, you know. So yeah, I don't know. It was cool.
Well, I mean, like I say, it's kind of hard to find, but you know, if you can find a copy, I really recommend
Marvel should reprint it.
Well, yes,
softcover.
Marvel, are you listening? But, you know, talking about adaptations, so, you know, Gareth, when you sit down with William Shakespeare, you know, but you do, like they were saying, you have, like, wordless sequences. I mean, you're not... I mean, if I can speak from my own experience, and no offense to anyone out there, but when I read a comic book adaptation where, you know, at the top of the panel it says the prose exactly from the book, and then there's a picture, you know, it says, and Captain Ahab was on a ship, and there's a picture of a ship, and Captain Ahab is standing on the railing of the ship waving at you. You know, I'm less a fan of that. Then with you break it up, you have fight scenes, you have, you know, silent panels, which in literary adaptations... not as much done. So how do you approach, though? I mean, how do you break down King Lear?
Well, it's interesting. There's really kind of two different answers to this question, depending on whether I'm talking about Shakespeare or anything else but Shakespeare. Because Shakespeare is a very particular animal, right? It's the, you know, his verse is so tight that, and it's all dialogue, of course. So there's no question of narration or no narration. So the challenge there is just simply to abridge the text and break it into small enough chunks that you don't feel like you're, you know, reading a whole section of the play and then looking at some pictures. And, you know, and that's challenging, and I play around a lot with how I'm going to break those up. Often I'll break out single iambic pentameter lines, you know, into one, you know, one line goes into one speech balloon. But when there's something that's more of like an important speech, then I actually try to preserve the feeling of the verse and preserve the actual verse line breaks. And, you know, and then Shakespeare gives you these little stage directions, like, oh, they fight, you know, and that's my cue to break out into a 5-page, you know, fight scene. But I also have to be aware that there's multiples of those in the text, and very quickly the book can balloon if I give them all 5 pages. When I'm doing something like The Odyssey, often what I'm actually trying to do is to remove as much I don't like to use third-person narration, basically. So in the Odyssey, the only parts that are narrated are the parts where Odysseus is narrating his own story because he's retelling it to the Phaeacians. And the rest of the time, you know, I'm trying to do any narration just completely visually, and again to keep the dialogue into short enough bursts that it, you know, that it flows with the pictures and you know, creates a nice rhythm. But it's true that there's a lot of unabridged or direct, people who use the direct text, and it does get clunky. And it's also because there often is somebody's doing the text adaptation and somebody else is drawing it, and that can create a disconnect as well.
Now, your first comic, we were talking about this actually, was your own creation, Bearskin, right?
Well, actually, that was still an adaptation, but it was a Brothers Grimm fairy tale, and it's a very short story. So that was a case where I was kind of expanding and kind of doing a riff on an existing story that was much shorter. So it was a little different. But
so but are you going? You're going to stick with that? Do you have your own story maybe that is brewing, or
Yeah, I have
notes collecting.
I have notes collecting, and I have original stuff. And what happens is whenever I finish a book, I give myself a couple of months to write. And usually a couple of months is not enough for anything to quite get to the right, to the state that I want it to be. I'm very critical of my own writing because I'm working with, Homer and Shakespeare, and I have a pretty high bar that I'm sort of trying to meet. So none of those has quite caught on fire yet, but someday.
Now, Jim, you also, after Street Angel, you worked on some books that were not adaptations, but you worked with, again, a fiction writer. It was Cecil Castellucci,
Yeah.
right? And it was for a series called The Plain Janes.
Right.
And which was aimed at, this was specifically aimed at girls, right?
It was definitely young adult.
Yes.
Is young adult aimed at girls?
Well, it was
or?
supposed to be part of that Minx line.
Yes.
There was this line of comics that was a little bit ahead of its time. So, how did you like that? Because you had done Street Angel. You were kind of, you worked with a writer, but not necessarily getting hired to illustrate a script. So how did you like working with Cecil on The Plain Janes?
I liked it a lot. An editor from DC contacted me about the opportunity and, told me who the writer was. So I went out and I think she had 2 books in print at that point, read those, liked those, and really enjoyed the process. I got to be friends with the writer. We would talk every week as I was working on it. She basically gave me the script, the DC gave me the script, and I would draw about 5 pages in a week, and then the editor and the writer and I would all meet each week and go over it, and it was a great experience. When I started making comics, I have a mental list of all the different things I want to do, and working within that Marvel DC system and with an editor was one of those things, and it was a very good experience. I think I learned a lot, and I really like Cecil's writing a lot. I continue to read her work. Yeah, she
has a bunch of prose only books, and she's done some other comics, but yeah, she's definitely worth seeking out. You had such acclaim with Street Angel. I'm not sure it sold tens and tens and tens of thousands of copies, but it had a lot of acclaim. And you went on to do The Plain Janes, and but instead of returning to Street Angel, you did Aphrodisiac, which was this really satirical pop culture 70s mashup kind of thing. So you did something different. Were you not thinking maybe you would go back to the Street Angel or?
Yeah, I just do what I want to do as much as possible. A big part of the reason I do this is because I don't want to boss. I don't want to work 9 to 5. I don't want to do the same thing every day. The Aphrodisiac book you're talking about was a series of short stories, and then as I made more short stories with Brian Maruca, my writing partner, we started to picture it as a bigger story arc for the character, and then started to seek out a publisher that was going to collect all the work, and we were going to sort of fill in the gaps to complete that as a graphic novel, as a complete story in one unit. And it's just a reflection of that's what I was interested in then, and I was very interested. It was inspired by blaxploitation films of the 70s, so I was watching those. It was inspired by superhero comics. It was very much set in the 1970s, so I was consuming a lot of pop culture from the 1970s, like comics, like movies, like books. I was reading crime fiction, and it just was what I was interested in as a genre, and so that's what I was making. It's a reflection of my interest at the time. You
guys are all so free. But it's awesome. It's awesome, and I think that's why. I don't know how many people here are regular comics readers. Who here actually is a graphic novel reader, or fan, or okay, well, there's some. But it's such a great time now, for graphic novels. There's so many wonderful books out there that I think it's because you get to do what you want. I think that's what really leads to, having that kind of inspiration as opposed to, not being inspired in what you do. I think that crosses over. What was this is a question that I asked, what was the first comic that you read that really blew your mind or made you be like, wow, this is the thing, this is my world, welcome to it?
I love this question. I read one of the worst comics, definitely a bad comic. It was a random issue of a series called Marvel Comics Presents. It was one of the first comics, maybe the first comic I ever bought. And by the time I had gotten home from the drugstore, I was convinced this was it. I'm going to make comics. And, it was a very bad comic, but I could see, I loved drawing. I liked kind of these stories and action adventure, and it was all in there. Even though the comic wasn't very good, I could see, somebody does this, and someday it's going to be me. Just because I reacted to the format, it's just like flipping through a comic book and just seeing those pictures and the characters moving around. That was all it took. So it wasn't very remarkable as a comic, but it definitely blew my mind as I could do this.
And the characters in that comic?
The Hulk, Wolverine, Marvel, it was Marvel characters.
Gareth?
Well, I grew up reading Tintin and Asterix, and I kind of had that in my blood, and I was drawing all the time. But I think the first comic book that really blew my mind in the sense of realizing what was possible and maybe making me think that I was going to do something like this actually might have been Bill Sienkiewicz's Moby Dick, which was the first adaptation that really was worth its salt. I mean, the Classics Illustrated line was great, and a lot of people grew up on that and it introduced them to the classics, but they're tiny. They're much too short to really do justice to any of the books that they're adapting, and the printing was bad, and some of the art was good, some of it was not.
There was not one panel in that book that said Captain Ahab has a whaler ship. Yeah.
That's right. Yeah. So Bill Sienkiewicz really, and the fact that he used all this mixed media, and you didn't have to just pencil, ink, flat color, that he just said throw that formula out the window, was very inspiring to me as well.
That's a great book. That's actually a great book, and I think you might still be able to find. I think it was reissued a few years ago, but the art is. I think
it was First Comics, right?
Yeah, I think it was only 48 pages long, and he does Moby Dick.
Yeah, they all were that length.
It's very impressionistic. But
I've actually seen the a panel from that used as a book cover for I think the Barnes and Noble edition or something like that. It was I was like, that's from that amazing Moby Dick adaptation,
Yeah. So what blew your mind, Farel?
Well, I mean, I was like Jim and stuff, where I grew up, reading Marvel comics, and all that was blowing my mind as a child. And I read the Blackbeard collection of newspaper strips, and I loved the Captain Easy stuff, and I was consuming all this stuff as a young person. But there was some point as a teenager where I just kind of lost interest in superhero stuff. And it wasn't until I got to art school in my 20s that I started finding other things that had been around, and it was this book Violent Cases by Neil Gaiman and Dave McKean, and I remember looking at that, and I just really responded to the artwork, and it actually made me make a comic. I looked at that and was like, okay, I'm going to make my own comic now, and I drew a comic in my junior and senior years in art school, and it was because of that book.
Right. That book, I believe, is still in print because it's written by Neil Gaiman, so there's been 20 editions of that book, and it's really good. It's actually, that's the one where it's a kind of a reminiscence of him. Yeah, it's a lot like The Ocean at the End of the Lane, actually. It's kind of the same theme. It was kind of Neil Gaiman early working out that theme in that book. As a comic. So, I know we have time for questions, and I'm going to ask a little bit more here. So if you have a question and you want to ask it, there's a mic so you can get right up there. Farel, you started out as an illustrator, right? I mean, I
went to school for illustration, and I've done it here and there. I don't think I was ever really that good at it. And throughout art school, while I was studying illustration, all this stuff, I was making my own comics still, and it wasn't until I got out of school after a few years, was I think I just want to do the comic book thing. And so now it's almost kind of anytime I have to do an illustration job, it's kind of sort of resent it, it's this isn't my idea, this is an art director's idea or someone else's idea. So yeah, I mean, I've dabbled in it, but
right.
It's not my passion.
You were part of a collective that was called Meat House, right? And you got all because you were in a class at school that was the most mad talented, like pretty much everybody in there is like
Yeah,
you
like
know,
James Jean and Tomer Hanuka are like
yeah.
two of the best
Yeah.
illustrators
I mean, James
out there.
Jean is like this, you know, world famous painter now, and Tomer does like New Yorker covers all the time, and you know, it was pretty, you know.
It was a special time for
Yeah.
me. Like I don't think I would be doing art if I hadn't been around those guys.
Yeah,
you know.
yeah. Did you? I mean, you have? Do you have a community of artists that you know, talk with or bounce ideas off of at all, or?
Not as much as I'd like, but yeah. You know, it's funny being in the book publishing world. I've suddenly got this huge network of children's and young adult authors that I'm friends with, and actually relatively few comic artists, although a lot of those people are now like, oh, I'm going to do a graphic novel for kids, you know. Yeah, I mean, you know, and I also went to school for illustration, and then just kind of, you know, ended up that the comics were the thing that I kept coming back to, and that kind of stuck. But yeah, it's always a, you know, there's always a little bit of a void where you're like, oh, I want to show this to somebody right now, and there isn't anybody right there.
Do you put it up on Tumblr?
Yeah.
That's what you do, you know?
Yeah.
And Jim, you live in kind of a little hotbed of, there's a little comics community there. You live in Pittsburgh, and, you know,
It's
a little
awesome.
secret cabal. I mean, do you have meetings regularly, or?
We do. Yeah, when I started doing comics, I knew one other guy that did comics. This was about 15 years ago. He's sitting in the back row, Jason Lex. He does the podcast with me. And we would get together each week, and we would just bring whatever we had done, you know, and it was sort of like encouragement, but it was also, you didn't want to show up with nothing, you know, you'd feel bad. And then we started to meet other people that were making comics in Pittsburgh. It's a relatively small town, so everybody kind of knows each other. And, yeah, having that community is huge. And, you know, we bump into each other now. It's less formal, but definitely we get together. We often riding to these shows, you know, we all do comic book shows together, and the car rides are sometimes my favorite part.
Yeah, because it can be very lonely, you know, when you're sitting at the drawing board all the time, right? It's
You spend a lot of time alone in a room looking at your drawing board in your head, essentially. So I think it's healthy to be out with other people as much as you can, and other cartoonists make it easy.
right. Well, we have a question here.
So, how does your work compare to like the storyboards that people do when they take things and move it into film? Is it kind of the same, or is it really its own different thing?
There are similarities. You know, you're showing it's visual narrative, so there's definitely some similarities. There are rules of, like, you know, show don't tell, things like that. You want it to be readable without the words, possibly, you know, as much as possible. There are differences in that you control you know, as a cartoonist, you have sort of a certain amount of space, unlike film, where you're restricted by the screen size. With comics, you know, you could be working on different size pages, you could be working online. So there's a lot of freedom in that. You know, so there are similarities and differences, and there are a lot of both.
It kind of depends on who you ask, too, I think. Like, I notice that's an easy go-to. Like, for me, I love movies and, you know, was raised on television and stuff. So, like, my work's very informed by that. But, like, you ask someone like Chris Ware, and he's very opposed to the cinematic approach, where he tries to do things that are very specific to the form of comic books that you can't do in movies, you know, like to slow readers down to make them do different things, like turning the book different ways to read things. And, yeah, I don't know, it's kind of interesting because I feel like, you know, like visually movies and TV are just, by their nature, going to be like more attractive, like immediately attractive to people. So, like, I think it's kind of like our job as like cartoonists to like kind of kind of question, like, why am I just doing this? Like, am I just sort of like imagining myself as a camera, and like, you know, or am I actually trying to like, you know, do something new or interesting, you know?
I think I can start to see some of those distinctions, kind of like art and photography. It's not just the real.
Well, your work is, I would call it a little impressionistic, I would say, just in terms of, or maybe expressionist.
I like that. I mean, I'm influenced by like fine arts and painting and all that kind of stuff too. But yeah, it's like I don't know. Like my usual go-to is like thinking of movies that I've seen that I like to draw from.
I think there's like a structural difference, which is like what you're talking about in the Chris Ware comparison, right? There's like, are you using the form of comics where space equals time, or are you using the form of cinema where time equals time? And then there's also the question of the art itself. In a storyboard, the art is supposed to be kind of transparent. Okay, this is a representation of what you're going to see as basically a photo, a moving photograph on the screen. And in the comics, like Farel's art, expresses a lot by the way it's drawn, which you don't get in film, although you might get in animation.
There was also some like little things like in my book now. Not trying to plug it or anything, but like as I was drawing this, like part of the story was about this like little boy who's sort of watching his life unfold, like the future of his life, and I just kind of had him like floating in a panel, and I just decided kind of as I was working on it to kind of put him in the border, and I was like, I should just make this a flip book. So it's kind of like animation sort of, but like I don't think you could do that necessarily with animation, like in the same way, like you're reading two things and it can be like taken in both ways. I don't know how many people will notice that that's a flip book, but it's like I like being able to do little things like that.
I'm totally checking that out. So that's cool. Sir, you have a question?
Well, this is for Gareth. Since you're using a lot of Shakespeare, I was wondering if you ever go down to the Folger and see how early artists illustrated Shakespeare's plays.
Yeah, one of the things that's been awesome about moving here is to be near the Folger and also the Shakespeare Theatre Company. But the Folger, of course, has this much deeper, older collection of all this historical costume design, and it's pretty amazing. And also, they've got this great recreation of a sort of, an indoor recreation of a kind of a Globe-style theater, and it's really fun to watch them put on shows there as well. But their collection is really amazing, and I haven't spent that much time with it yet, but that's one of those things that I intend to go back to again and again.
So a totally different question. So I'm intrigued with this whole idea of communicating in a different way. And I like that you're taking these challenging things. I mean, I'm sort of directing this to Gareth, but I think it's relevant to all of you. Do you think there's any way you could do this for poetry, or is that so involved in the language that it just doesn't make sense? But it's another thing that's becoming less and less accessible to people, and yet it's such a beautiful thing.
Well, I'll just say that, I mean, there's a lot of different kinds of poetry, and in one sense, pretty much everything I've done is actually an adaptation of poems, right? I mean, Shakespeare's written in verse, The Odyssey is written in verse, Beowulf's written in verse. It's all written in verse. Now, if you want to talk about the kind of poetry where you really want the audience to just savor every word, then I think having an image there is actually getting in the way. And sometimes when I've seen illustrated poetry books, I actually don't want to see those images there. But that doesn't mean it can't be done well. But
yeah.
Actually, were some poetry comics a few years ago.
There are cartoonists too that associate themselves they consider themselves as poetry and comics. Like Warren Craighead III, I know he's shown in like Arlington, I think. Frank Santoro, who's a Pittsburgh cartoonist, does a lot of work that's somewhat poetic in nature. Austin English is a cartoonist that is very closely tied with poetry and doing sort of formally inventive work that is highly influenced by poetry. So it's definitely, there is a subset of comics and cartoonists that are interested in poetry and comics.
And there's a new book out that is also by First Second, published by the same people as do the Wrenchies, that is an adaptation of World War I poetry, where they get a whole bunch of different artists and they do adapt the poetry. So I'm not sure if it's out yet, but it should be out I forget what it's called. It's like Above the Dreamless Dead or something like that. It's a very famous line of poetry. So, it is attempted, yeah. Well, it's exciting.
I actually have two questions. Yeah. Okay. Jim, a question for you about Street Angel. I really loved it. But what stuck with me is the one with the young girl, and it's so vivid that she's homeless and she's hungry and she's looking for food. So I just wondered, there's a lot of humor in Street Angel, but I also wondered about the social commentary, if you intended it, just sort of came with it, if you could talk about that side.
Yeah, I don't really think about my work as having a platform for social commentary. To be honest, the story that you're referencing, it was very well received. I think that's a lot of people. That's their favorite story, from the first collection. It's in the National Archives if anybody actually wants to see the drawings. But it was somewhat intended as a parody of indie comics at the time, which were, there was a lot of navel-gazing that went on and a lot of sort of, I don't know if melodrama is quite the right word, but, it was a little bit intended to poke fun at some of these cartoonists that were interested in social commentary in their work. And, I think that parody in today's world, like the sincerest form of parody is like trying to actually do whatever that thing you're trying to parody is. And so, I was somewhat trying to do a sincere comic, and it was a contrast with what had come in the first couple of issues. I thought it would be a chance to surprise readers a little bit, and and to add some characterization to Street Angel, who, as you note, is homeless, and I wanted to show that. So,
my second question is for Farel, and mostly because I was really blown away by it, and I think I probably have to read it a few more times. And I know you spent some years working on it, and how you kept track of it in terms of the storyline. I know just authors have talked about sort of plotting things up on their walls. Is that how it worked for you, or how did you deal with developing that complicated story?
Yeah, there was some of that, especially towards the end. There was some like serial killer-esque wall pattern things that were done. I basically just had like a plot that I was working from, and kind of adding notes as I went along to like stuff that I wanted to do in the future, like the rest of the book. And maybe like 30 pages at a time, I would thumbnail it. And then I'd have to spend maybe a couple weeks before doing that, trying to make everything sort of fit together, because I definitely had like an ending that I wanted to get to. And I had a lot of points that I wanted to hit throughout it. At some point I did have to make like an actual timeline of because I play with time a lot in the story, so kind of jump back and forth. So it was kind of confusing to me at first. But then, by the end of the book, it all makes sense to me. I understand that someone reading it might be kind of confused or challenged, but like I said, it all makes sense to me. It's it's not like stream of consciousness or anything. I wasn't just making it up as I went along. It was definitely planned out.
All right. If we have any more questions, now's your chance. Last call. All right. Well, you know what? We'll just to finish this up. Let's talk about just the dreaded. You finished your project. Now what? So what's coming next for all of you? Farel, I'll start with you.
I'm working on a sequel to Popgun War, and it's going to be run in an anthology for Image Comics that's being edited by Brandon Graham called Island. And I'm also doing a science fiction love story for Dark Horse Presents called The Ear Farmer with the writer Chris Stevens.
So Macbeth is coming out in the spring, and I am actually just getting started on a collection of Edgar Allan Poe short stories, so that probably won't be out for a couple of years.
I'm finally returning to more Street Angel and hope to start drawing new stories October 1st, so keep an eye out for those.
A few short weeks.
How does this work? Does this work through electronic stuff as well? Is this stuff that goes on to Kindles? Sometimes it sounds like a stupid question, but I'm just curious.
Yeah, Wrenchies is available on Google Play, I think, and some other format.
You could download them. The Kindle Fire, it looks okay on. Looks best on an iPad.
Yep.
Sorry to plug Apple, but it's a lot. Digital comics look a lot better. They're kind of optimized more for the iPad. But yeah, you can download them for any of your devices.
Is that what most of your readers are? I guess I just think of electronic media as
I think novels are the ebook format has started to overtake the print format, but for comics and picture books, it's still lagging far behind.
Yeah, and there are a lot of delivery systems, digital delivery systems. I plan to serialize Street Angel online through, maybe like Boing Boing or somewhere, a bigger site. But they're also available for devices, to download complete stories and issues and the whole book and stuff like that. So.
Yeah, I think there's something about the object quality or something that I think people that, or people that grew up liking comic books or something. I think it's kind of like a different thing. So I actually do a web comic that I print and stuff, but it's I did it specifically for the web. Like I even planned it out to like kind of fit on a screen. And I just saw that as just like another way to get readers, you know. I was like, it's here for free on the internet. I also have a print version if you want to buy it, because I almost feel like they're almost like two different things, you know.
Well, on that note, thank you so much for coming. Thank you, Jim. Thank you, Gareth. Thank you, Farel.